in the new little United States back in the early 19th century. And she traveled on the Erie Canal, among other places. And her black book, dating from 1828, is about her travels. She started on the Erie Canal at Lake Erie at Buffalo and traveled down through the Niagara area, which is what we'll be talking about, and then on toward Albany. So I think this particular excerpt really does need to be read aloud. It doesn't really read too well just visually. So anyway, it staggers belief and nothing but reality, the huge machines yet standing on the margin of the canal with which the stone was removed out of it, the mountains of stone heaped up on each side, and the certainty that you are actually sailing through a mountain could wring the truth from us that this stupendous work was performed by man. At the end of this excavation is Lockport, which takes its name from 5 double locks combined together, each 12 feet and a quarter rise. Now we'll get into what Anne was talking about as we go along through the program. First off, just a little quick recap. After the American Revolution, this is the United States, the Eastern Seaboard, basically, the former British colonies. But it was very clear right from the very beginning that people were going to be moving out into what they called the West, the Ohio country. And by the early 19th century, states were beginning to form out here. They'd made the Louisiana Purchase. There's all of this territory out here that is now, they hope, going to be settled and grow and develop. But it was recognized from the very beginning that for this to happen with any kind of speed and efficiency, there was going to have to be a huge amount of connection, commerce, communication, travel, shipping, transport, back and forth from the original states into the new territories. If this whole new country was going to be stitched together, there was going to have to be a massive amount of shipping and transport, millions of tons of stuff moving around. And in the late 18th, early 19th century, particularly in North America, if you wanted to move a large load of anything over any kind of distance, and I'm not talking about 100 pounds of salt humped around on the back of a pack horse, but if you wanted to move 20 tons of nails for 900 miles, you did it by water. And there are lots of waterways in North America. Right from the very beginning, people began attempting to get water shipping and transport connections from the East, from the original states, into what they called the West. One of the more famous attempts was done by a group that included George Washington. They invested in a scheme that was going to lengthen the Potomac River and connect it to the Ohio system. It failed. They all failed. There was one little problem, the Appalachian Mountains. This really was a barrier, not just to getting a water connection between the East and the West. And of course, getting a waterway up over the mountains and down just wasn't going to happen. But foot traffic, wagons, horseback, we forget this today. For the first several decades of the United States, getting back and forth was incredibly difficult, very expensive, very time consuming, hideously complicated. This really was a barrier to connecting the original states and the West. And indeed, at first, it was feared that the West might go off on its own and become its own country if they couldn't connect. As we know, the solution was to get a connection into the Western waterways by what came to be called the Erie Canal, getting into Lake Erie, from which they could connect to the Ohio, getting into the upper Great Lakes from Lake Erie, from which they could connect into the Illinois and the Mississippi. This is how they had to get into the West, the solution being in New York State. And as all of you know, this is what they did. It was recognized very early in the 19th century that if you started at New York, which conveniently enough is a seaport, New York was long since using the Hudson River as a shipping route. This was just ideal for shipping. The way through the Appalachians, even then, was the Mohawk Valley. The problem was the Mohawk River itself wasn't something that could be, at that point in time, adapted and made navigable for shipping. It's very shallow and it's steep and it's fast and it's rocky. A number of attempts were made and they failed. But a few people realized very early in the 19th century that it ought to be possible, not that they really had any idea how they were going to do this at that point, but it ought to be possible to put an artificial waterway from the Hudson through the Mohawk Valley, right next to the river in many places. Once they came out the other side of the valley, the western end, they would be past the Appalachians. And if they could keep this going all the way across New York and connect it to Lake Erie, now there would be a water connection between the east and the central part of North America. Once they could get into this whole water system out here, they're in. Of course, not quite that simple. As you know, construction started at Rome in 1817. It only really took New York State less than 10 years to get around to doing this massive project. They had attempted to get the federal government to do it and been soundly rejected by President Thomas Jefferson, but the state committed to doing this thing. Construction beginning at Rome in 1817 built outward in both directions, east and west. And they knew right from the start, since none of these people had ever really built canals before, that they were going to have to do a lot of learning, and they were going to be dealing with a host of problems and difficulties that no one had ever really overcome with a canal anywhere in the world. And they were simply going to have to learn as they went how they were going to do this. We're getting feedback from somebody. Anyway, one of the big problems, and there were a lot of them, one of the very biggest problems, perhaps arguably the biggest, was down here in the western end of New York State, the Niagara Escarpment. This is essentially a high cliff or very steep ridge that starts just west of Rochester, goes all the way up into the Great Lakes. Okay, we're hearing people in the background. Somebody would need to mute, I guess. Otherwise, it's going to interfere with the discussion here. This is a huge barrier, the Niagara Escarpment. This is down below. Up to the north is lower. To the south is higher. So here we have one of the original maps of the Erie Canal. And as you can see, getting across the state, here's the Niagara Escarpment. Just to complicate things, here's the escarpment on a kind of a zoomed in or blow up. So here's Lake Ontario to the north. This is down. Here's Lake Erie to the south. This is up. Somewhere, this canal that is going to be coming along the Lake Ontario plain from Rochester, nice level, no locks at all, lots of water to fill and empty separate parts of the canal. Somewhere it has to get up to the top of this thing to get up into Lake Erie. And in most places around here, this is, well, it's a very steep ridge, but essentially it's a 300-foot high cliff in most places. That's just not possible to get a canal straight up and down 300 feet in one place, circa, say, 1815, 1820. Now, just to add even more complexity, let me just point out that this area up here, as you can see, has very little in the way of water. So trying to fill sections of canal and locks would be extremely difficult. The water would really have to be pumped up into this area from someplace else. And this whole area above the escarpment is actually higher than Lake Erie. So if they had tried to go up this way from Rochester, they would be climbing much higher than Lake Erie and then would have to climb down with a whole series of locks. Again, somehow they'd have to find water. They'd probably have to pump it up from Lake Erie to do all of this. This is just not going to work. And to add even more fun to the equation, here's another ridge behind it. Yikes. This little arrow indicates part of the solution. Here, and this, by the way, where the pointer is at the moment, is where Lockport came into being when they put the Erie Canal through here. Here, the ground slightly slopes down toward Lake Erie. It's still higher, but it begins to slope down toward the Niagara River and Lake Erie. And this is going to be critical to the solution. Here's the Niagara Escarpment, or as the, okay, we're hearing people in the background again. As the canal builders knew this, this is the mountain ridge, and you can see why. You know, around here, this is basically a 300-foot high cliff. Very steep, very difficult. Here's Lake Ontario up here to the north. Here's part of the escarpment. You can see from looking down up to the top of the mountain ridge, this is just not going to happen in most places. It's just not feasible. Now, very quickly, I should point out that these last three slides, all showing pictures of the Niagara Escarpment, are not at Lockport. Trying to get one, I've been cribbing images from the internet, trying to get a picture of the escarpment here in Niagara County is very difficult, actually. But these are pictures just from a little bit to the west of us in the Canadian province of Ontario. And as you saw, the escarpment goes all the way up into the Great Lakes and down into Wisconsin. So this is the same formation. It's huge. This image up here is not to scale in any direction. So don't even think of that, but this just shows you relative heights. Here's Lake Ontario. This is to the north. The canal is going to be coming to the west from Rochester along the Lake Ontario plain, not right at the shore, but close to the foot of the escarpment. Here's Lake Erie up here. And as you can see, there's about a 300-foot difference that they had to get up to get into Lake Erie. Lake Erie is little more than 300 feet above Lake Ontario, but they weren't climbing quite that far. Down below is one of the original elevations of the canal. Now, this is to scale on a horizontal scale and also on a vertical scale. They're different, but this is a little misleading. This is Lockport. This is what they had to do to get up. So here's the Lake Ontario plain. Here's where they have to get up to the top to get up to Lake Erie. If this scale actually matched the scale down below, this little zigzag series of locks would be a straight line up. The artist had to show each individual lock here, and he had to try to do little zigzags. There were 83 locks all along this thing. But in order to do that, he had to space out the climb at what became Lockport over 5 miles on the scale down here. And it's not. It went straight up. So this would be actually a straight line up. Anyway, here's the key to the whole solution to the problem of the Niagara Escarpment. Here in this yellow area is a low point on the escarpment, coming from the west, coming from the east, from both sides. The top of the escarpment dips down and forms a low point, and there's an ancient dry gorge that cuts in about a mile or so deep. This is very ancient. This is on the order of like 100 million years or so. However, this is still higher than Lake Erie, but this ancient gorge and the low point are the key to the solution here. This is where, if they got up anywhere, they would get up to the top, because if they brought the canal around the corner, which they did, as you can see, to the end of the ancient gorge, here they would only have to get up and down about 70 feet. So that's kind of a no-brainer right from the start. 300 feet, 70 feet, this is where it's going to happen. Not that getting there was easy. As you probably know, all across New York State, building this canal, they ran into a host of problems and difficulties. One of the things they had to do right from the start is cut down millions and millions of trees. This is not really a good picture of, I think, an old growth forest. The trees would be much bigger than this even, but in the Niagara region, just north of the Niagara Escarpment, they encountered essentially what used to be called virgin timber or old growth forest. Although humans have probably been living in the Niagara area here in what is now Western New York State for probably several thousand years, there never had been permanent habitations along below the escarpment. So really, timber had never been cut down, and they were cutting through some really big stuff just to get to the point where they could dig or cut through the ground to get to the ancient gorge at the Niagara Escarpment. there's a very good reason why humans had never settled in this area, not even villages. And down here in this corner, you can see why. Our scaly little friend down here. The Niagara Escarpment and the ground below it are full of cracks and crevices and caves and lots of water and springs and things running out. This is just ideal as far as a rattlesnake is concerned. This is rattlesnake heaven. From the human point of view, the Niagara region was infested, and the rattlesnakes actually took a terrible toll on the workers as they were moving toward and down the ancient gorge to get to the low point on the escarpment. Nevertheless, they persisted. Here we have it. You can see, here's the canal coming along from Rochester, from the east, coming around the corner, southeast or southwesterly up to the end of the ancient gorge, getting up to the top. More about this section in a few minutes. Here's the ancient map, or here's one of the oldest maps. This is the dry gorge, and it was a dry gorge. And notice they found a nice little feature here, part of, again, an ancient water system that was long since dried up, what is a natural basin. We'll see pictures of this in use. This is just a wonderful little gift from Mother Nature that allowed them to have essentially a harbor down here where they could put in wharfs and docks and load and unload and everything. So this is great. Here at the end of the gorge is where they had to climb up the 70 feet. And again, to the southwest here, this is up. So this is down. They have to climb up to get to the top. If you look at this blow up, you can see just a hint of what they actually did here. 5 levels of locks, actually a double 5 levels of locks, 2 sets of locks, which we'll look at in a moment. This type of a staircase of locks, where you go from one lock right to the next, stair steps of locks, no canal between them at all. This is called a flight of locks. You have a flight of stairs, you have a staircase of locks, it's called a flight of locks. For obvious reasons, this was quite famous as the flight of 5. The concept of putting a flight of locks at the end of the ancient gorge to get up to the top of the escarpment was really first proposed by one of the Erie Canal engineers, David Thomas. A little bit later on, that was taken up and developed into the full solution by another one of the canal engineers, Nathan Roberts, and his group. And Roberts was actually the person who was put in charge of, okay, you say you can do this, build it. So not only did his group come up with the ultimate design, and it's a 2-part design, more about that in a moment, they also were put in charge of building it. Here's what they did. This is actually a mural, a 20-foot high mural that we have in the Erie Canal Discovery Center, adjacent to the locks in Lockport. This was commissioned by a bank in Lockport in the 1920s for the 100th anniversary of the completion of the canal. And this is actually supposed to show the big grand opening celebration in October 1825, when everything was finally finished. Here's what they did. You notice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and a double staircase. So this would be for boats going up. The artist has the boat coming out of the wrong side. This would be for boats going down or eastbound. Construction at Lockport began in 1823 and was finished just about 3 years later, almost 3 years later, in October of 1825. So this is half of the solution. The flight of 5 to get up and down the end of the gorge here, heading up. At this point, the canal is going into the picture, which would be southwest, down toward, well, actually toward the Tonawanda Creek and the Niagara River. Here's the plan of the original flight of 5. You can see it again, 5 stair-step locks. These are all the standard size of an Erie Canal lock in the 1820s. All the Erie Canal locks were 15 feet wide and 90 feet long. This is huge for the 1820s. Most of the locks on the canal, when it was first completed, could lift a boat about 8 feet, which is big for the time period. The locks in Lockport could lift 12 feet. So these things were absolutely massive and very impressive. Here's a view of Lockport. This was from about 1836, so this is about 10 years after the completion of the Erie Canal. And you can see the Flight of Five. You can see the natural basin. This is misleading in one way. This really whole area down here should be absolutely clogged with boats. The canal was the main link between the east and the west. And as soon as the whole thing was completed, it was heavily, heavily used. Here again, we see a central staircase for people to run up and down, I guess, the 5 levels of locks and the big, huge wooden lock gates, and sprung up around it, a town which didn't exist before they began putting the canal through here. This is what became Lockport. Now, looking at this, there's just kind of a little hint that there's something else going on here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then behind this, the 5th one. Here's a bridge up above it. This is higher. We can see it a little better on the 1920s painting. They didn't go all the way up to the top of the escarpment here. Here's the top of the escarpment, but this bridge is over what is actually an artificial canyon cut into the face of the escarpment. Remember we said this is higher than Lake Erie, and the ground behind here actually slopes down toward Lake Erie, and there's no water up here to fill and empty this whole huge set of locks, much less the upper canal. This is actually a 2-part solution. They came up 60 feet out of the 70 with the Flight of Five, and then they began an artificial canyon through the bedrock known as the deep cut. Now this, we don't have a graphics program, so don't laugh at this. This is totally not to scale in any direction, but this would be just kind of like a very crude cutaway view looking from the side. This would be the ancient dry gorge that they would have to bring the canal down. This would be the climb to the top of the escarpment. Then they would have to go downhill and along eventually to get to Lake Erie. What they did, of course, was bring the canal down the ancient gorge, go up 60 feet, not all 70, with the Flight of Five, cut into the face of the escarpment and carve a canyon. This isn't a tunnel, this is a canyon. Knowing that as the ground sloped down again, 7 miles later, they would come out above ground where Pendleton, New York is today, connect to the Tonawanda Creek, run down to the edge of the Niagara River, run down the Niagara, not the river itself, but next to the Niagara River to Lake Erie. This is the other half of the project, the deep cut. And you can see it on the map here. Here's the canal coming from Rochester, around the corner, up into the end of the gorge. Here's where they climb straight up, basically, with the Flight of Five. Here's the deep cut, the 7-mile-long artificial canyon, which they took down and joined up to the Tonawanda Creek. The Tonawanda Creek was one of the very few places on the entire Erie Canal where they actually used an existing natural body of water. They canalized it, they widened and deepened it, and diverted the flow and put in control gates and everything. So now here's the canal running down toward the edge of the Niagara River and then running along next to the Niagara River all the way down to Lake Erie at what is now Buffalo. This deep cut, the 7-mile-long man-made canyon, was actually one of the modern marvels of the 1820s. You know, you tell people today, this is solid bedrock. You know, they cut through this for 7 miles. It's kind of like, oh, big whoop. You know, we do this all the time. This is before high explosives, no dynamite, no power excavating equipment. This had to be done by hand, and there was nothing like this anywhere in the world at that point. Here's what they were dealing with. This is a view of the Niagara Gorge below Niagara Falls as it's running through the lower Niagara River toward Lake Ontario. This is just a little bit to the west of us here. Same geological underlying formations here. This also cuts through the Niagara escarpment. So here they are exposed. This top layer, which is what they were dealing with for the deep cut here, is called Lockport dolomite. It's very similar to limestone. It has more magnesium and calcium carbonate in it. It's hard rock. So They had to go through 7 miles of this by hand. And here you can see the Niagara Gorge from this view is about 300 feet high. So good idea of what they were cutting through as they had to build the deep cut here at Lockport. It was an incredible undertaking at the time. And if you remember from the beginning of this little program, the excerpt we did from Anne Royal's Black Book, she talked about the huge machines yet standing. These are adapted farm equipment. These cranes were developed for hoisting the huge chunks of rock out of the excavation at the deep cut. And like much of the equipment that was used along building different sections of the Erie Canal, the people who were designing these things took existing farm equipment and adapted them, made them bigger, made them stronger, made them more useful. So these things were still standing when Anne Royal traveled through the deep cut when it was full of water. And again, she talked about the huge mounds of stone still heaped up on either side. The spoils piles, basically. These were there for a time. Then they all kind of disappeared because they were freely available to anybody who wanted to use this stuff for building. So when I show you a picture of the building that we have the Erie Canal Discovery Center in, which was a church built in the 1840s, it's built from, like a lot of early Lockport buildings, canal stone. Down at the end here, you can see an explosion. This is not dynamite. This is black powder. This is gunpowder. That's what they had to work with. Gunpowder is not terribly powerful, but it's the only explosive available at the time. It can be used to make an explosion. It's about as explosive as modern day gasoline would be. It's incredibly tricky to work with, very dangerous. There were a lot of injuries and fatalities working on this deep cut. Here's one of the things that was used on the Erie Canal, and especially the excavation here at Lockport. This is a star bit drill. Really, this is a percussion drill. Percussion drilling is a very ancient technique and still used today, where you put the bit onto the rock face or the rock floor and pound the other end and pound, 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 and then turn the bit part way and pound, pound, pound again. You keep doing that until you have excavated a hole big enough to pack with, in that case, a gunpowder charge. We're not absolutely certain that this particular star bit drill was used on the Erie Canal. We don't have a really good provenance for it, but it's certainly the correct type. This is also what is known as a Botsford drill. These are made of iron, as they were in the 1820s. A blacksmith here in what became Lockport, named Mr. Botsford, nobody knows his first name, Mr. Botsford developed a way of hardening the iron for use with these star bit drills in the excavation at Lockport. So here we have a Botsford drill, which is in the collections of our collection, the Niagara County Historical Society. Here's a photograph of the deep cut. Now, obviously, this is several decades later because this is a photograph. We're guessing 1870s, 1880s. This is kind of the end farther away from Lockport. So you can see it's not quite as deep. The ground is sloping down toward the southwest, but this just gives you a good picture of what it would look like. And again, in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, this would have been crammed with boats going in both directions. Here's the towpath. And I like this photograph. Just a little side note, it's kind of interesting. You notice here, this is a wooden platform. There's another one up here. There's another one up here at intervals spaced all along this part of the deep cut. Underneath is a hollow area. This is in place because these guys, the mules who were pulling the boats, occasionally, apparently ended up in the drink. Initially, the water was only 4 feet deep, but really there was no way for somebody this size to get up to the top onto the towpath again. What they would do if the mules ended up in the drink is bring them down along here, lift out the wooden platform, bring them into the hollow area. Apparently there was a step or a ramp or something under there. They could get them back up onto the towpath again. Just a little side note, but I think that's cool. The towpath still exists through the deep cut even today, although it's not really accessible to the public. These were long since filled in with concrete, but they're still there. Anyway, here's Lockport, looking down from the top of the flight of 5. So you're looking kind of north easterly here, that once you get around the corner, the canal is going to go to the right and head east toward Albany. Here's the Flight of Five, here, double set of locks here. You can just see kind of the natural basin down there. They've got floating docks and wharfs and things down here. This again is misleading. This should be full of boats. This Erie Canal, and once this section here in Lockport in Niagara was completed in 1825, the entire canal was finished. This was the primary east-west connection for the United States for quite a while in the 19th century. Any major shipping going back and forth from east to west went through the Erie Canal. So this, you can think of this as interstate number one. This would be very busy. This actually played a very important role in the growth of the United States, not just New York State, but the whole United States, very largely owes a debt to the Erie Canal. And you can see this. Here's the Erie Canal. Here are just the major, not all the minor ones, the major waterways and canals that were developed after the Erie Canal was completed in the west. Again, here in the east, this is a little misleading. This is not actually a connection here. If we got rid of the word Pennsylvania, you'd see that there's just a dotted line, which means that here are the mountains and they couldn't get a canal over the mountains. So this east-west connection, the Erie Canal, connected all the waterways in the eastern seaboard with all the waterways out in the west, and of course the whole upper Great Lakes region as well. This was a critically important part of the growth of the United States. Here's the 1836 view of Lockport again. By the time this was being drawn, and this is really the only good period depiction we have of the original version of the Flight of Five. By the time this was being drawn, New York State had already experienced a problem that traffic planners, engineers deal with even today. They always have. Today, you build a nice interstate highway with 4 lanes, and everybody starts using that right away because it sure beats all the back roads and city streets and everything. Now you need an 8-lane highway. Well, here we are in New York in the 1830s. The state has already recognized this is a tremendous success. They just finished paying for it. Now they have to make it bigger. So beginning in the 1830s, section by section, piece by piece, the Erie Canal was modernized, enlarged, widened, deepened. Locks were made bigger. Here you can see Lockport in 1839. Here's the Flight of Five as it was built in the 1820s. Here they're excavating out to the side to put in bigger locks. So here's a standard lock from, as you can see, the Erie Canal enlargement. This is not one of the locks at Lockport, but it's the plan for a single double lock, not a 5-level set of locks. These are bigger. Instead of being 15 feet wide, now they're 18 feet wide. Instead of being 90 feet long, now they're 110 feet long. At Lockport, the same 12-foot lift was retained. So here's the version of the Flight of Five that still survives in part today. Here's a central set of huge stairs. Here are the 5 westbound lock chambers going up. Here are the 5 eastbound lock chambers going down. And you can see at each lock, the big balance beams that stick out on either side for people to push and pull on to open and close the locks. This, of course, is a photograph. This is taken probably around the 1870s or 80s again. Here's the towpath, which is still there, by the way. And of course, here are these guys. These guys were incredibly important. This is from the mid 1890s, but these are the lock tenders. These are the ones who pushed on those big balance beams, and you can see them up here. They pushed on them to open and close the locks. The locks were always opened and closed, filled and emptied manually. Even from the very beginning, they were filled and emptied not from the locks up above to down below, but rather from underground conduits running along both sides of the locks. They had valves, they still do, in the bottom of the lock chambers. So every lock chamber here could be filled and emptied independently by the lock tenders. Notice something else, and this is kind of cool. There are still traces of these to be seen down at the locks even today. These iron foot plates, you can see a man standing on it. This gave them traction for walking on when they were pushing on the balance beams that opened and closed the locks. So here we have the end of the 19th century, still some wooden canal boats coming through. By this point, the railroads have made their mark on the United States, and the United States stretches really all the way across the continent at this point. New York State has realized that there is still a role, an important role for the big waterways, like the Erie Canal, like the big river systems. But it's no longer to get people back and forth quickly. It's no longer to carry perishables, which could only be taken for a short distance anyway. The role of the waterways by the end of the 19th century is very clear, is to carry the big, huge loads of stuff, grain and ore and lumber and fuels, coal, raw materials, building supplies, ironmongery. You know, the railroads could carry them, but it would be very expensive and you have to fill up car after car after car after car. Whereas if you put all this stuff, 40, 50 more tons on a big barge, you can move that. It doesn't absolutely positively have to be there overnight. It's easy to move by water. It's cheaper to move by water. So the waterways still have a role to play. And in the early 20th century, as you know, New York State began converting what was then the Erie Canal to what they called the New York State Barge Canal. And just by the way, not to confuse things, but it's called the Erie Canal again. That's a marketing thing from a couple of decades ago. So it is still the Erie Canal, but the route is different in some places. Again, the canal was widened and deepened. The locks, the 19th century locks, were replaced. When they worked here in Lockport, what they did, starting around 1910 or so, was they ripped out the 5 eastbound chambers, the down chambers, and excavated out here to the side to put in the big locks. So in our next slide, we're going to see this all ripped out, and you're going to see the exposed wall of the staircase. Here it is. So here's the central staircase, here's the exposed wall. This is where the locks were in the 19th century. On the other side, they're still there. More about that in a moment. Excavated out here to put in the big locks. Now, once they ripped out all of the 19th century locks from this side of the central staircase, then they kind of rebuilt a whole wall along next to it out of concrete, filled it in and put buildings on top. So what we usually say when we're explaining to people what they're going to see today is, back up here for a moment, these locks have been filled in. Well, in a sense, yes, they have. And here's where the modern locks were put, which you can see here. This shows the deep cut up above, the artificial canyon, being widened and deepened in the first part of the 20th century. And you can see here they have canal excavators, excavating machines to do what they used to have to do before. And of course, you can see they have big power equipment up here, the big steam shovels and cranes and things. This is what you see today at the locks in Lockport. Here's the central staircase from 1842, from the enlarged locks. Here are the 5 westbound lock chambers still there, not because they use them for boats anymore, but because they use this as a spillway to help control water levels down here now. Here are the operating locks, the 20th century locks, which are still in use. And here is where you would have had the 5 eastbound chambers. Now it's filled in and there are buildings sitting on top of this. So this is what you see today. The locks, of course, are still in use. A few years ago, the surviving 1840s lock chambers began one by one to be cleared and restored. Actually, there's a nonprofit group that has been one by one restoring these lock chambers. And you can see this kind of gives you an idea of the scale. By modern standards, these things are paltry. By the 19th century standards, these things were huge. They have replaced now or put in 3 sets of rebuilt wooden lock gates. And what they're doing with those now is demonstrating them on Saturdays in the summertime. They have volunteers who push and pull and open and close. They've built not a full-sized canal boat, but a little Durham boat. This was a very commonly used boat in the 1840s on canals and rivers all over North America. So this is smaller than a full-size canal boat. They use the Durham boat to pull through the locks so people can understand why the water's going up and down and why the gates are opening and closing. So if you get here in the summertime, especially on a weekend, this is cool. Here are the operating locks. This, by the way, is a group of fourth graders from the Erie Canalway Heritage Corridor Ticket to Ride program. They have a program where fourth grades can apply for admission and transport to various selected Erie Canal museums. The Erie Canal Discovery Center here in Lockport is one of them. And then they come and we have a whole program for them, both in the Discovery Center, and then we take them down to the locks. And here you can see that the lock masters, who have been wonderful helping with all the educational efforts, we're opening and closing the locks. This is probably in early May or maybe late October, and there wouldn't be any boats going through here. You can tell that this was taken from the side here. If there were a boat coming through here, just as a little note, these guys would have to get off the bridge, not because it would be unsafe, but because standing above a boat passing under them, they do what fourth graders might be expected to do, and we're not allowed to do that anymore. Anyway, there are things to see and do at the locks. I mentioned the traces of the footplates that are still there. Actually, the whole locks area, the 19th and 20th century locks area, are marked out with a series of signboards and labels and displays that help people understand what it is they're looking at. These have been put in by the same group that's been restoring the lock chambers. There are two commercial attractions that operate in the locks, as well, or by the locks, as well as modern day shipping. The Lockport Locks and Erie Canal cruise starts below the locks, goes up through both sets of locks on a narrated cruise, goes up into the deep cut, comes back down. It's about a 2-hour trip. Next to the locks, because there's all this water up here, and so you have a nice water drop available for use in turning water wheels and machinery on both sides of the canal, adjacent to the locks. They had waterways that were built, in this case, an underground tunnel, a water race. This is called the Lockport Cave, an underground boat trip. They take people up through the water race, show them the traces of industry, and actually at one point put them on a little flatboat. So we have two commercial attractions that people can see when they visit the locks at Lockport today. And of course, we have us, the Historical Society, the Erie Canal Discovery Center. This is the Canal Stone Church from the 1840s. This is just across the parking lot from the locks. Here again is our, as we call it, the iconic mural. We have exhibits and displays about building the locks and the deep cut here. We have a sort of a 15-minute interactive movie that starts people off on their visit. And we usually give people a little background, whether they go up into the Discovery Center or just visit us at the Lockport Visitor Center, which is also in here, to help people understand what it is they're going to see when they go across the parking lot and down into the locks. And we can give people a little list of what they have to see down there. We also have the public restrooms, and of course, being a little nonprofit historical society, we also have the museum shop. So if you do get to Lockport, we hope you can stop in and visit us. Anyway, to end the program, this is what you see in Lockport today. Here's where the Erie Canal, Lockport Locks and Erie Canal cruises go through. Along the side here is where you have the Lockport Cave. Up to the corner here, just adjacent, is the Erie Canal Discovery Center. All throughout this area, there are signboards and displays. This little building, which was originally the powerhouse that generated electricity to operate the 20th century locks, has now been converted to a very nice new exhibit by the same people who have been restoring the locks. So if you get in there, there's a really nice background on building the locks and the canal, etc. So anyway, just to kind of quickly end up, I hope you do get to Lockport. It's not terribly that far a drive from Ithaca. Ideally, if you come in the summertime, you can have lots of different things to see and do. Even if you come in the wintertime, you can still go down and walk all through the locks area. So we hope you can come. And with that, I guess I will kind of end the program and turn it over to Zach and see if he wants to solicit any questions.
Yeah, yes, please. Thank you, Ray. Fascinating, interesting combination of engineering feats and history, and particularly the relevance to local history. Really interesting stuff. So thank you. And I would guess at some point here, once we can get back to a little more state of normality, we might visit Lockport again, and this time visit the Discovery Center. I'm going to claim the first question since I have the power to, but we will after I ask the question, I'm going to give everybody the power to be unmuted, and I guess sort of I would imagine there'd be some questions, and just take it slow. Try not to step on each other, and we'll open it up for questioning in a moment. My question though was, it occurred to me that it's so dependent on water and water being in the right place. I was wondering if there were times when, the canal, this major piece of infrastructure, would come to a complete halt if there was a drought. How dependent were they on the water supply, and did they have a backup if there was a time of little rain? So
that's a very good question. Very good question. And actually, from the very beginning, one of the reasons, if you look at the, maybe if I end the slideshow here, if I can do that, and back up to certain slides here, way back up. Can you see this?
Yes,
okay,
along the side.
Here we are. One of the reasons for the original 1820s route of the canal kind of zigzagging all around like this is because when this was being surveyed and laid out in the 18 teens, they were hunting all across the state for local reliable sources of water and drainage. And I should quickly just sort of point out that here in Lockport, the whole upper section of the Erie Canal here going down through the locks the water comes out of, at that point at least, came out of Lake Erie. So this is endless supply of water here. But all along the whole route, there were local sources of water and drainage. Every section of the canal then and now could be individually isolated. There were control gates, not just the locks, but control gates, and still are, all along the canal. So every section could be isolated if necessary, if there was a blowout or damage or something like that, which does happen. So repairs could be done, but the rest of the highway could still be used at that point in time. And every section was filled and emptied independently. Today, just to confuse things, the 20th century barge canal actually in this area starts at the Niagara River. To get from the end of the canal to Lake Erie, now powered boats, no longer pulled by mules, can go up and down a channel in the Niagara River. So today, the water in the upper section of the canal actually comes out of the Niagara River. And today, the entire section from the Niagara River to Rochester is actually filled and emptied and controlled from Lockport. But that wasn't possible in the 19th century. So every little section was controlled, filled, and emptied locally.
All right, so I'm going to allow you all to be unmuted. If you have a question, physically unmute yourself and jump in.
I have a question. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
My question is, how did the How was this all financed?
Aha.
Where did they get the money?
Very, very old technique known as government debt. New York State went in, New York State put up bonds for this. And that, believe me, that drew an awful lot of opposition and criticism that really wasn't something that at that point, really anybody in the United States did. And actually the canal was such a success, so profitable that the state paid off the bonds in 10 years.
This is the people using the canal, the shipment?
Yes.
They paid a fee?
Yes, there was a toll. However, the cost of using the canal for somebody who was shipping or traveling, they usually say is maybe about 10% of what it would have cost to move that load overland.
Yeah.
So you hate to say it was a win-win, but it really was a win-win.
Very good.
Anyone else?
I have a question about the workers on the big excavation, the escarpment excavation, but generally in that part of the canal. We hear all the time now about immigration and who's coming to do the different things. What were the primary sources nationally, ethnically, for workers for this thing?
Well, actually, most of the digging and canal building all across the state was done by local people, the people who lived in the area. They would go to the villagers or the towns or the farmers and basically say, who would like some extra money? Oh, great, here's your shovel. You do hear a lot about the Irish laborers who worked on the canal. Unlike later on in the 19th century out in the West, where Chinese laborers were actually imported to work on the railroads, which today we would probably consider to be trafficking. But Irish were not imported to work on the Erie Canal. There were a lot of Irish immigrants floating around North America, not just the new United States, but also British Canada up here. And many of them were looking for work, and here's 8 years worth of work. So some of them actually signed on early on and worked all along the length. Some of them just came on at different points in times. There were quite a lot of Irish laborers who gravitated to the long-term projects like the swamps in the central part of New York. And if the Irish laborers' name for malaria, which they got in the swamps, was ague shakes. Here in Lockport is kind of really interesting. There wasn't a community here before the canal was put through. There wasn't even a farm where the canal went up over the escarpment. And the native peoples, the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations peoples who were living in the Niagara region at that point and still are, were the Tuscarora. They were, of course, familiar with the Anglo-German American settlers, the white settlers, but they were telling us when the work in Lockport began, all of a sudden, these other people showed up, and the Tuscaroras had never encountered these people before, and looked different, and they dressed differently, and they spoke a completely unintelligible language, and all they did was dig and dig and dig. So not having a name for them, the Tuscaroras called them Renakget, which means the groundhogs. Those were the Irish.
Oh, wonderful story. Thank you.
Who uses the canal now to transport items? And is it still less expensive than transporting items by road?
For certain types of large loads, yes, it is. You see, again, the major waterways all across the United States are still in use today because in the late 1950s, the United States and Canada opened up the St. Lawrence Seaway. It is now possible to get between the Atlantic Ocean and the Upper Great Lakes through the Seaway with ocean-going vessels. So when that happened in the late 1950s, the larger commercial use of the state barge canal kind of dried up intentionally. Today, there is still some commercial shipping on the canal, mostly at the eastern end. There are Canadian grain shippers who come down through the Oswego Canal and go down to the port of New York. There is a certain amount of industry along here that uses big things like General Electric, if they're still called General Electric down in Schenectady, sometimes makes huge generators or turbines that really can only be moved elsewhere in the world by water. The western end is almost completely recreational now, although you may remember, you might have seen in the news just a couple of years ago, a microbrewery in Rochester was expanding and bought something like a dozen 300,000 gallon stainless steel fermentation tanks. The only way to get them to Rochester was by water. They were so big and so heavy, no other way to move them. So that was kind of fun because there were a whole bunch of people who kind of followed all along the canal, and they would race to the next set of locks and wait till the beer tanks came through and would take pictures, and then race down the canal and take pictures of the beer tanks again. So, but normally this end is almost completely recreational.
Neat.
That's a great story.
A question. You mentioned how this canal was really different and perhaps more extraordinary than any other canal in the world. And I was just wondering if you could comment on how was this so different from like building canals in Venice or 1,000 miles of canal in China? What made it particular?
Yes. Well, many engineering historians will say that at that point in time in the 1820s, this was the longest contiguous canal or dug canal in the world. And, you know, questions about the Grand Canal. A lot of people at the Erie Canal Discovery Center who are just learning about this for the first time ask us, so is this the first canal in the world? It's like, no, those have been around for thousands of years. And as you point out, an earlier version of the Grand Canal in China that eventually ultimately connected the Yellow and Yangtze rivers was in place beginning in the well, almost 2,000 years ago. And of course, even before that, there have been irrigation canals, navigation canals. One of the models actually that the canal builders looked at when they were first learning how to build canals, several of the canal builders went to Europe on their own and studied existing canals. One of the models was what had originally been called the Canal Royal, which is now called the Canal du Midi in France, which essentially connected the Atlantic cutting across southwest France to the Mediterranean. That was about half the length of this, but it was a very well-built thing for its time. It was begun in the 17th century, actually. Another one of the models that the canal builders looked at was the, oh gosh, it's either the Broadwater or Bridgewater Canal in Britain, which was only about 7 miles long, but it was well engineered. It was a, you know, early 19th century canal that was just extremely well engineered. So they went and studied that as a model. This you know, is it the biggest ever? No. Is it the oldest? No, certainly not. Was it incredibly impressive as an engineering feat? Yes. I mean, this was world famous, justifiably so. You know, we're not going to sit there and claim, hey, this is the ultimate canal ever built. No one would say that, but it was a massive, at the time, engineering feat. Actually became the model for lots of canals around the world, not just canals here in the United States or North America, but actually lessons, designs learned from this project were applied to canals all along especially throughout the 19th century. And for that matter, if I can just jump in again, let's see here, if I can, oh, I hate to do this now, but let me see if I can end the show here again and pop down to another one. You notice, where's our little picture here? Here we are. Okay, whoops, there we are. We'll go to this one. You notice the 20th century locks here. And of course, these are replacements. They've been replaced a few times, but in the 1940s, the father of one of the members of our historical society had served in the military during the Second World War. and came back home after the war and went to school on the GI Bill. He went to art school and eventually became an artist. For one of his homework projects, I think it was 1945 or 1946, he went down, since he lived in Lockport, he went down one evening and began sketching the locks. And he got arrested. Turns out it was illegal to photograph or sketch the locks because these were the model for the original Panama Canal locks, and it was national security and everything. He got off because Dad knew everybody in town. But the point was that these were actually models for locks elsewhere in the world.
Huh. That's great.
Neat.
Any more questions for Ray?
Was there a specific reason why they started at Rome?
That was kind of broken up. I couldn't hear that.
Was there a specific reason why they started at Rome?
Oh, yes, there was actually. Back up again. Give me zipping up and down through the pictures here, but very good reason. Actually, we have people who ask, oh, come on now. Just do it. There we go. We have people who ask a number of questions, and that's one of the big questions that we get. Every decision that was made, not only where they were going to go, but what they were going to do, how they were going to do it, because these people had never built a canal before when they began work on this, and because this was hideously expensive, this cost $7 million in the 1820s, every decision was very, very, very carefully considered. So they did everything with a very good reason. Yes, they started at Rome for a very good reason. First of all, this is the hands-on learning curve. None of these people had built canals before. This is where they had to get their hands dirty and really learn how to build canals. And as it turns out, the ground around Rome turns out to be fairly forgiving and fairly relatively easy to cut through or dig through. Also, there's a source of water at Rome, and going west and going east, the ground slopes just very slightly down in each direction. So they have a source of water, they have
Froze.
Ray, can you hear me, Ray?
I think he just froze.
Yeah.
Yeah.
from the water source going slowly.
You hear me, Ray?
Got
Ray?
that?
Yeah, you
Yes,
froze
Ann.
there.
Yes.
I don't know, about 2
Yep,
minutes.
I'm okay.
Froze again.
Yeah, we seem to have.
Yeah, the internet seems to be, oops.
Well,
Did we entirely lose him? Oh,
I
no,
think we lost him.
I see him down
Hi.
in the corner there. Hi.
internet.
Well,
Sorry.
I think we got the gist of your answer, that it's the soil, the ground is easiest to carve out
Yeah.
starting in Rome, and there's a good water supply. Did anybody else have any questions, or that may be the reason to say the end of the presentation?
Just a quick question. You mentioned the indigenous people, which is the Haudenosaunee. Did any of the Native Americans actually work on the canal, and what was their overall response to what must have been quite an invasion of materials and people
Okay.
to the areas?
First of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Okay. We have to remember that by the time the Erie Canal was being surveyed and constructed, the great state of New York had quite successfully managed to reservationize the Haudenosaunee all across what became New York State. So yes, they were taking some land, but they were taking some land from private landowners, but this wasn't a particular situation where this was the massive displacement and dispossession of the Six Nations. That had already taken place before they began work on the canal. Were there large groups of the native peoples who worked on the canal? We don't really know. I mean, some could have been employed if they wanted to. Probably some were, but labor records just don't seem to exist.
Interesting.
All right, any final questions here?
I
Maybe
have
one-
a secondary shout out. Think that was a fantastic presentation, but I noticed Roger has joined us. I hadn't seen him at a GIAC before. And if you have not seen it, Roger has been doing this wonderful presentation through the History Channel on flight in Ithaca. It's an adorable little show, about 8 minutes a week. And we can get you the information. I think that our people would love seeing his flying in Ithaca presentations. I know Jerry's watched it, and he's just a lot of fun to view with his cohort.
Well, I'd be happy to do something sometime, a reenactment or whatever. This is a series of 5 learn at home lessons that they're actually aimed toward middle schoolers. And
Perfect.
Perfect. That's us.
perfect for my that's when my development stopped. But we cover the history of industry basically in Ithaca during World War I. So the 2 or 3 things that were going on besides a war that needed airplanes, that the training planes were built in Ithaca. There was a silent film industry at the same time that was making war movies. And there was a little thing called the Spanish Plague. So if you do look at any of the episodes of this that the History Center has put up, you'll see that we're, I don't have the right one, but we're all wearing masks that say Thomas School of Aviation with a little biplane on the mask, because that is this was an actual flight academy that was in Ithaca at the same time. And for $400, you could learn to fly, and then you could go off to war or go on an air show and barnstorm or whatever you wanted to do. But so we tell these stories in the period. So we're all wearing our masks so we don't get whatever the virus is. And there's a war going on, and I'm hoping that some of the kids will get some sense of that history repeats itself, I guess.
Yeah.
But I'd like to do something for GIAC.
Yeah, well, looks like one thing leads into another. So
Yeah.
I'll definitely explore the idea, and it's nice to see you here. Welcome. As far as today goes, Ray, it was really fascinating, and thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. Like I say, I hope to meet you in person sometime in the near future. Maybe this summer we'll be able to make it over there. If not, hopefully it won't be too long beyond that. And it's great to see you all. And thanks for the presentation. Thanks for showing up.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful. And thanks, Zach,
Terrific.
for doing this.
Thanks. Thank you. It's a great show.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.